There is a kind of goodness that is not learned in the pews or on the pages of the holy books. It is born in the hearts of those who have known the cruelest cold, not only the one that freezes the skin, but the one that freezes the soul. In the Arizona territory, where the sun punishes by day and the desert punishes with biting cold by night, this rare goodness sometimes flourishes in the most unlikely places. Thomas Mitchell knew these two faces of the desert well. He had spent 17 years patrolling these lands as sheriff of Cedar Ridge, a small town that had grown up around a train station and 3 saloons. His gray beard bore the dust of 1,000 rides, and his faded blue eyes had seen things he had preferred to forget. He carried a crescent-shaped scar on his chest, a reminder of an Apache bullet that nearly found his heart 5 springs ago. The winter of 1876 arrived with a fury that no one expected. Snow fell for 3 days straight, covering the parched ground with a white blanket that turned the familiar landscape almost unrecognizable. The mountains in the distance disappeared behind curtains of snow, and the wind howled between the wooden buildings like wailing ghosts. It was the kind of storm that tested not only the endurance of the bodies, but the strength of the spirits. Thomas was riding along the main trail when he saw her. A small figure walked through the snow, stumbling every few steps. He approached slowly, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of the revolver. Experience had taught him that in Apache territory, every shadow could hide danger, but as he got closer, his heart tightened in a way he didn't expect. She was an Apache girl. She couldn't be more than 7 or 8 years old. Her bare feet left red trails in the snow, and she shivered violently under a leather dress too thin for the cruel cold. Her black hair was stuck to her face by ice crystals, and her lips had the bluish color of someone who was losing the battle against the cold. But it was his eyes that left Thomas speechless. There was no fear in them, just a fierce determination that he recognized as being the same kind that kept men on their feet during the worst of times. The girl stopped when she saw the horse approaching. He lifted his chin proudly, even trembling, and looked Thomas straight in the eye. He didn't say a word, but his posture spoke louder than any scream. She was willing to die standing, with dignity, as the warrior she was by nature and birth. Thomas got off his horse slowly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that surprised himself. He had spent years fighting Apache tribes. He had lost friends to his arrows and spears. But there, in front of that brave child bravely facing death, all the old rivalries seemed small and meaningless. The snow kept falling, each flake a silent reminder that time was running out. Thomas knew he had only a few minutes to make a decision that would change everything. She could continue riding, let the desert decide the girl's fate, as she had done so many times before with other misfortunes that crossed her path. Or he could choose a different path, one that might cost more than he was willing to pay. The wind blew harder, carrying with it the smell of fresh snow and something deeper, something that spoke of choices that define a man's character. Thomas felt the weight of the years on his shoulders, the weight of all the times he had chosen the easiest, safest path. But this time, looking at that little Apache warrior shivering in the snow, I knew I couldn't live with myself if I made the easy choice. The girl took another staggering step, and Thomas saw that he couldn't stand up much longer. His small hands were clenched into fists, fighting the cold that was already overcoming. It was a sight that would break the heart of the toughest man, and Thomas Mitchell, no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, was not made of stone. He opened the heavy coat he wore, revealing the woolen vest his late wife had knitted years ago. The fabric still carried the smell of her, lavender and hope, things that seemed to belong to a different world from that unforgiving desert. Without saying a word, he approached the girl, moving slowly so as not to frighten her. The Apache child watched him intently, his dark eyes studying his every move. Thomas could see the keen intelligence behind that gaze, the same cunning that made his people so fearsome in battle. She knew she was at a disadvantage. She knew she was freezing to death, but she still maintained the proud posture of someone who never learned to bow down in the face of adversity. True goodness does not announce its arrival with fanfares or grandiose speeches. It just happens silent as falling snow, transforming barren landscapes into something new and unexpected. Thomas Mitchell discovered this in that freezing moment, when he held out his coat to a child who was supposed to be his natural enemy, but who had become, inexplicably, his responsibility. The Apache girl accepted the coat without hesitation, but also without showing exaggerated gratitude. It was as if he understood that that gesture was not born of pity, but of something deeper and more respectful. She wrapped herself in the heavy fabric that swallowed her completely, leaving only her dark eyes visible. Thomas noticed that she smelled the wool discreetly, perhaps sensing the traces of lavender that still lingered in the fabric. The sheriff mounted his horse again and reached out to the child. She hesitated for a moment, studying that calloused hand that had once taken up arms against her people. But the cold was stronger than the pride, and she allowed Thomas to lift her, settling in front of the saddle with the natural dignity of an Apache princess. The ride back to the city was silent, punctuated only by the sound of hooves in the snow and the wind that cut their faces. Thomas felt the weight of the decision he had made growing with each step. Cedar Ridge was not known for tolerance of the natives, especially after the raids that had hit some farms the previous spring. Taking an Apache child into town was like lighting a powder keg with your bare hands. When the first buildings appeared through the snowy mist, Thomas felt the girl stiffen against his chest. She also understood the danger. His people had taught him to recognize hostile territory, and that city certainly fit the definition. But he did not try to flee or resist. She remained motionless, prepared to face anything that came her way. The streets of Cedar Ridge were deserted by the storm, but Thomas knew it wouldn't last long. News traveled fast in small towns, especially controversial news like the one he was about to create. He headed directly to his own house, a simple wooden building at the back of the sheriff's office. Inside the modest house, Thomas lit the wood stove and prepared a warm bath for the girl. She observed everything carefully, memorizing every detail, every possible way out. It was impossible not to admire that keen intelligence, that ability to remain alert even in a state of exhaustion. When Thomas pointed to the bathtub and then to her, the girl understood immediately. She undressed without embarrassment, revealing a small body marked by recent scratches and bruises. There was a thin scar on his left arm, probably from a knife or spear. Thomas looked away respectfully, but not before noting that this child had already experienced more violence in his few years than many adults would experience in a lifetime. While the girl was bathing, Thomas prepared a simple vegetable and jerky soup. He had no experience of caring for children. He and Martha had never been able to have children, but he figured that a hungry child would not be much different from a hungry adult. Hot food would be a start. When she got out of the tub, Thomas offered some clothes that had belonged to Martha. They were too big, but they would serve to keep her warm. The girl dressed in silence, then sat down at the table and waited. He didn't touch the food until Thomas sat down too and started eating. It was a sign of respect and caution, traits that seemed to be intertwined in his nature. They ate in silence, two strangers separated by different cultures and histories, united only by the basic need for survival. Thomas watched discreetly as the girl ate with calculated care, never completely letting her guard down, always ready to react if necessary. It was a constant reminder that despite her frail appearance, she was the daughter of warriors. When they finished eating, Thomas pointed to the bed in the corner of the room. It was where Martha used to sleep when she was sick, next to the heat of the stove. The girl looked at the bed, then at Thomas, clearly trying to understand his intentions. He made simple gestures indicating sleep, then pointed to himself and a nearby chair, making it clear that he did not intend to approach her during the night. The Apache child nodded and headed for the bed, but before he lay down, he did something that completely surprised Thomas. He took the thinnest blanket that was on the bed and brought it to him, spreading it towards him. When Thomas hesitated, she placed the blanket over her legs gently, then went back to bed and covered herself only with the sheet. That simple gesture hit Thomas like a punch in the stomach. The girl, who had only a thin blanket between her and the deadly cold, had chosen to share what she had with him, not because I needed their protection, but because I recognized their kindness and wanted to repay it. It was a demonstration of generosity so pure and unexpected that Thomas felt his eyes burn. He tried to return the blanket, but the girl shook her head firmly and turned to the wall, ending the argument. Thomas sat there, holding that piece of fabric that represented much more than protection from the cold. It represented hope, humanity, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, different people could find ways to care for each other. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside that simple house, something hotter than any fire was beginning to grow. Thomas did not yet know how he would explain this situation to the city. He did not know how he would protect this brave child from the prejudices and fears of his own people. But in that moment, wrapped in the blanket she had insisted on sharing, I knew I had made the right choice. The dawn brought with it more than light. It brought altered voices and heavy footsteps approaching Thomas Mitchell's house. The snow had stopped during the night, but it had left behind a tense silence that preceded the human storm that was to come. Thomas woke up in his chair, the Apache blanket still over his legs, and knew immediately that his worst fears were coming true. The girl also woke up, her heightened senses picking up the danger before the voices even became audible. He sat up on the bed with the upright posture of an alert soldier, his dark eyes fixed on the door. He showed no fear, only that instinctive preparation that his people developed from the cradle. Thomas quietly admired her courage, while her heart tightened for the responsibility she now carried. The knocks on the door came like hammers, aggressive and impatient. Thomas recognized the voices. They were some of the city's most influential merchants, men who had lost goods, and sometimes family members in conflicts with tribes in the region. They were good men in their own minds, devoted fathers and husbands, but also men who had allowed pain and fear to poison their hearts against anything that reminded them of their enemies. Thomas opened the door slowly, positioning his body in such a way as to block the view of the interior of the house. James Crawford, the owner of the general store, stood at the head of the group, his face red from both cold and anger. Behind him, 5 other men crowded, some carrying shotguns, all with expressions that promised trouble. The accusations came in bursts, like bullets fired in sequence. Someone had seen Thomas entering the city with a small figure in front of his saddle. Others swore they had seen suspicious movements in their home during the night. Paranoia had spread through the city like fire in dry grass, fueled by the fear and distrust that had always existed just beneath the surface of civility. Thomas listened to the accusations in silence, his hand resting on the handle of the revolver, more out of habit than actual intention to use it. These men were not bandits or murderers. They were frightened neighbors, people who had built their lives in that harsh city and who saw threats in every shadow. But that did not make them any less dangerous to the child who had slept under their protection. When he finally spoke, Thomas chose his words with the care of a man walking through minefield. He explained about finding a child lost in the snow, about the moral obligation of any decent person not to let an innocent soul die of cold. He didn't mention that he was Apache, not yet. He knew that this revelation would turn worried men into an angry mob. But James Crawford was not easily fooled. He had lived long enough in the territory to recognize the signs, to read between the lines of what was not being said. She pushed Thomas aside and entered the house uninvited, her eyes searching every corner until they found what they were looking for. The girl was standing by the bed, wearing Martha's oversized clothes, but her posture and facial features were unmistakably native. She looked James Crawford straight in the eye, not retreating a step, her small but unwavering courage in the face of the palpable hostility that filled the room. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Thomas could see the emotions running across Crawford's face, surprise, anger, and something more complex that was perhaps recognition that this child did not live up to the image of a monster he carried in his mind. But the surprise lasted only a moment, before being replaced by cold determination. The other men entered behind Crawford, filling the small space with their menacing presence. But something strange happened. None of them could keep their gaze on the girl for long. There was something about their quiet dignity, in their refusal to show fear, that made them avert their eyes uncomfortably. Crawford was the first to recover, remembering the role he had assumed as the city's protector. He began to talk about dangers, about how Apaches could not be trusted, about children who would grow up to become hostile warriors. His words gained strength as he spoke, fueled by the quiet approval of the other men. It was then that the girl did something that no one expected. He walked to the table where he had a piece of bread from the night before, picked it up, and returned to where Thomas was. With deliberate and ceremonial movements, he broke the bread into 2 unequal pieces, taking the smaller one and offering the larger one to Thomas. The gesture was so simple, so fundamentally human, that it cut through all the rhetoric and prejudice like a sharp knife. Here was a child who, even in the face of hostility from armed adults, kept his humanity intact, that he chose to share his meager food with someone who had shown kindness, even though he knew that someone belonged to the people he considered an enemy. James Crawford stopped talking. The other men shifted positions uncomfortably, their weapons suddenly looking heavy and unnecessary. It was hard to maintain hatred when faced with such obvious innocence, with such pure generosity. The child was not asking for anything. He was not trying to manipulate or deceive. She was simply being herself, and that was more powerful than any argument. Thomas accepted the piece of bread with solemnity, understanding that this moment had become something sacred, something that would define not only the girl's fate, but the character of all the men present in that room. He ate slowly, his eyes never leaving the faces of the other men, silently challenging them to see what he saw. The girl ate her own piece with the same solemnity, and when she finished, she did something even more surprising. He walked up to each man in the room and bowed his head respectfully, a formal greeting that acknowledged his humanity even in the face of his hostility. It wasn't submission, it was courtesy, the kind of behavior that civilized people were supposed to show each other. The last man to receive his bow was James Crawford. The girl paused before him for a longer moment, her dark eyes studying his face as if trying to understand the pain she saw there. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he took a small plain stone from the pocket of his borrowed clothes, probably something he had kept from his previous life, and offered it to him. Crawford looked at that small stone as if it were a venomous snake. His mind was fighting against itself, years of hatred and fear battling the obvious evidence that this child was not the enemy he had built in his imagination. The stone trembled in his outstretched hand, a humble gift from someone who had nothing to give but a gesture of peace. Thomas held his breath, knowing that the next few seconds would decide everything. Crawford's choice would determine not only the fate of the girl, but the soul of the town itself. It would be a moment of grace or a moment of shame that would haunt them forever. There are times in a man's life when his entire story comes down to a single choice. James Crawford held that little smooth stone and felt the weight of all the years of rage, of all the sleepless nights thinking about his lost friends, of all the nightmares that had haunted him since the attacks. But he also felt something else, the innocence of that Apache child touching a part of his soul that he thought had died long ago. His hands trembled, not only from the cold that came through the still open door, but from the battle he fought with himself. The stone was smooth and warmed by the girl's touch, simple and honest as the gesture that had accompanied her. Crawford looked up and met the child's gaze, seeing there not the face of the enemy, but the eyes of a soul who had known suffering and yet had chosen goodness. Slowly, very slowly, James Crawford closed his fingers around the stone and put it in his coat pocket. He didn't say a word, but the gesture spoke louder than any speech. The other men watched in silence, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others looking relieved that they didn't have to make an impossible decision. The tension in the room changed like wind changing direction. It didn't disappear completely. There was still a lot of fear and mistrust, but it turned into something more complex, more human. Thomas felt his muscles relax for the first time since he'd heard the voices approaching. He knew that the battle was not completely won, but an important war had been avoided. It was then that the news arrived that would change everything. A knight rode into town as if the devil himself was on his heels, shouting about a group of Apaches approaching Cedar Ridge. It was not a war group, he explained breathlessly, but a small delegation carrying a white flag of truce. They came looking for something or someone. The girl raised her head when she heard the word Apache, her eyes filling with a hope she tried to hide. Thomas understood immediately. Those proud people had come for their lost child. They were probably relatives, perhaps even their parents, who had followed their tracks through the snow and danger until they found the white men's town. James Crawford looked from the girl to Thomas, then to the other men in the room. A quiet decision passed between them, the kind of understanding that only happens when people face a moment together that defines them. Without discussion, they walked out of the house, the Apache girl following by Thomas's side as if it were her natural place. The Apache delegation waited at the entrance to the city, 5 warriors on horseback and an older woman who carried the authority of a matriarch. Their faces were masks of careful control, but Thomas could see the tension in their bodies, the way their hands rested near their weapons. They came in peace, but they were prepared for anything. When the older woman saw the girl walking beside Thomas, something changed in her expression. It wasn't just relief. It was recognition that your child was okay, was being treated with respect. The girl ran up to her, and the woman got off her horse to hug her, whispering words in Apache that sounded like prayers of gratitude. What happened next would remain in Cedar Ridge's memory for generations. The Apache matriarch approached Thomas, her eyes scanning his face with the intensity of someone who could read souls. Then, to everyone's surprise, he took a blanket from his own horse, a finely woven Apache blanket with patterns that told stories of courage and honor, and held it out to the sheriff. Thomas hesitated, understanding that this was not just a gift, but an acknowledgement, a bridge being built between two worlds that rarely found each other at peace. He accepted the blanket with the same solemnity that he had accepted the little blanket from the girl the night before, and for the first time in years, he felt that perhaps there was hope for something other than perpetual hostility. The girl then did something that no one expected. He ran back to Thomas and for a moment hugged his legs with the strength of someone who understood what he was leaving behind. Then he took out the thin blanket he had insisted on giving him the night before and returned it, but in a special way, folding it carefully and placing it over the new Apache blanket in his arms. It was a gesture that spoke of remembrance, gratitude, and a connection that transcended the barriers of culture and history. The simple blanket, dyed by the sweat of fear and warmed by shared kindness, became a symbol that even in the most unlikely circumstances, humanity could flourish. James Crawford approached and, to everyone's surprise, including himself, took the small stone out of his pocket. He did not return it to the girl. It had been a gift, and he would keep it forever. But he showed it to the Apache matriarch, a sign that he had been touched by the child's grace and that he would take this lesson with him. The match was silent, but not empty. There was waving of hands, respectful bows of the head, and looks that said more than words could express. The Apache girl looked back one last time before she disappeared around the bend in the road, and Thomas was sure she smiled, a small but bright smile like a star in the desert sky. In the days that followed, Cedar Ridge didn't magically transform into a place where all differences were forgotten. There was still tension, there was still fear, there were still people who couldn't look beyond their own prejudices. But something had changed, something subtle but deep as water finding its way through solid stone. Thomas kept the two blankets in his home, the simple and the ornate, side by side over his bed. They served as a daily reminder that real goodness knows no borders, speaks no specific languages, carries no particular flags. It simply exists, waiting for moments like that to blossom among people brave enough to recognize it. James Crawford never spoke about that morning, but people noticed subtle changes in him. He was more patient with children in his shop, more willing to listen before judging, more likely to see humanity where before he saw only threat. The small stone remained in his pocket, a talisman against the harshness of the world and a reminder that even the most hardened hearts could be touched by genuine innocence. And somewhere in the mountains of Arizona, an Apache girl grew up carrying the memory of a gray-bearded sheriff who had chosen goodness when he could have chosen indifference, of a town that had found its humanity at the most unlikely time. She would become a bridge between worlds, a storyteller who would talk about days when enemies could become protectors and strangers could share blankets against the cruel cold of the world. The desert holds its secrets, but sometimes on clear nights when the wind blows gently between the cacti, you can still hear the echo of that simple lesson, that a shared blanket is worth 1,000 drawn swords, and that the courage of a child can be enough to transform the hearts of men who thought they were beyond redemption. If this story of courage and generosity has touched your soul like snow touches the barren desert, you can't pass up our next journeys through the wilderness of the American Wild West. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any adventure that tells about men and women who have found their humanity in the most unlikely places.